Democrats love to use the term resistance to describe their efforts against President Trump and his initiatives.
Another line of attack amongst those on the left is that Trump and his billionaire pals are taking over the country.
What if the truth is that the real battle is not between the people and the billionaires, but the billionaires versus the billionaires? That's the premise of Gabe Kamisky's recent piece for the Free Press titled Inside the Trump Resistance, funded by the ultra-wealthy. He starts off by describing a meeting between former Biden and Harris staffers. These staffers discussed a project called Families Over Billionaires, which is meant to lead public pushback against GOP tax cuts for the wealthy. Mia Ehrenberg, the spokesperson for the initiative, told the Free Press that the project was teaming up with grassroots organizers to spread this message. But, Kaminsky writes, in fact, like a surprising number of Trump 2.0 resistance pop-up groups, Families Over Billionaires owes its existence not to small dollar donations from ordinary Americans or to grassroots organizers, but to a single entity, the consulting firm Arabella Advisors, which oversees a massive dark money network bankrolled by the super rich and aligned with the Democratic Party. Here to discuss more is Gabe Kamisky himself. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by discussing at greater length. Please elaborate. What is the source of this initiative, and is it structured in such a way to make people think that, oh yeah, the grassroots donations, small dollar stuff is just pouring in because there's this widespread resistance like we saw with Trump 1.0?
Yeah, so this new organization that you just mentioned called Families Over Billionaires launched with an 8-figure war chest, and it's releasing videos pushing back on the looming push in Congress from Republicans to cut taxes for the wealthy. But if you go on this group's website, you notice that there's actually not an option for the public to donate to it. They're not accepting money from ordinary Americans. The reason for that is because they are actually, according to corporate documents that we reviewed, legally a trade name of two organizations, 1630 Fund and the Hopewell Fund. These are two nonprofit organizations funded by some of the wealthiest people in the United States, people like Reid Hoffman, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, that are part of a large dark money network called Arabella Advisors that obscures its giving and is based in Washington, D.C. So we sort of are juxtaposing here how this group, which is portraying itself as a grassroots example to the Trump resistance, is actually legally one and the same as a very powerful group funded by, ironically, billionaires.
So look, I mean, I am sympathetic, to say the least, to the argument that there's too much money in politics, generally speaking, and we've had, between Robbie and I, had this debate numerous times, and I've always said that I don't think billionaires should have as much influence as they do on American politics, regardless of whether they lean to the left or to the right. But in your piece, I notice you go on to quote a guy called Scott Walter, who's the president of a conservative group, the Capital Research Center. And in the piece, he says the resistance is almost pure AstroTurf, not grassroots. Just to be clear, I mean, he's referring, I assume, to organized groups. There isn't really any doubt that there is a significant number of people in this country who have enormous objection to Donald Trump's agenda, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you hit the nail on the head there. So of course there's people, there was a new poll that just came out. There's, I believe most of the country, there was not a favorable opinion right now of how the Trump administration is going right now, right? And so Families Over Billionaires and groups like it could very well be representing, public concerns with things like tax cuts and some of the more right-wing policies of the Trump administration. But I think what our piece outlines really well is how this group and others like it, it's important context for people to be aware of as they're saying, claiming to represent ordinary Americans. They are, in fact, funded by billionaires. And by the way, this is not something particularly distinct to this administration. We could look at the last Trump administration, the Biden administration, and see certainly that there were conservative organizations launching lawsuits and filing things like ethics complaints with the federal government or Congress that all were connected to, sort of right-wing networks, particularly a network shaped by conservative activist Leonard Leo. And there's been a big clash in Washington, D.C. between this conservative network shaped by Leo and the Arabella Advisors network. Conservative activist Leonard Leo actually shaped his right-leaning funding network based on Arabella Advisors. So this is not necessarily new, but it is representative of how few and not often are groups actually grassroots, particularly when there's a lot of money involved and they're advocating against administrations.
Well, and is that really what you're doing here? I mean, it's turnabout is fair play. I remember going back to even the Tea Party movement. What was that, 2010, et cetera? So much reporting in the mainstream media about how this was all AstroTurf and how what you're really seeing is large moneyed financial interests. In particular, that's when everyone became aware of who the Koch brothers are, and I always have to disclose every time we bring them up that I've worked for organizations that have certainly taken money from the Kochs in the past. So make of that, whatever you will. But that was those were major stories in the mainstream media all the time about the level of funding by wealthy people of this activist scene, of legal challenges, of the things you're describing. And I think what you're doing, correct me if I'm wrong, is saying there's also a lot of that on the Democratic side as well.
Oh, absolutely. And at the Free Press and in my prior job at the Washington Examiner, a lot of my reporting has focused on Arabella Advisors, and it's something that often gets ignored in legacy media outlets just surely because of you can read stories about families over billionaires or groups like it. They just happen to often leave out sort of the important context. And I think for right or for left, either of these examples, I think it's relevant for people to, certainly be aware of the actual power players behind these groups, just because it's not to say, oh, they're, discounting their arguments inherently. It's just, transparency certainly is important when they're calling themselves grassroots, I think.
And tell us a little bit more about Arabella Advisors. You do go into it in your piece about some of the people who have funded it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill Gates was among those mentioned, a number of others. So just tell us a little more about its workings and what it does.
Yeah, Arabella Advisors is a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C., and it handles administrative management and takes large fees from about 6 nonprofit organizations that are also based in D.C. and actually share a physical address in Washington, D.C. with Arabella Advisors. Now, the reason this organization, I think, is particularly notable is because all those nonprofit funds, groups like New Venture Fund, 1630 Fund, which is one of the largest Democratic political action committees, spends hundreds of billions of dollars to support candidates. These nonprofit groups, in turn, through an arrangement known as fiscal sponsorship, sponsor hundreds of trade groups across the United States that essentially are particularly difficult to track as far as their financial funding because they do not have to file financial disclosures with the IRS. And so what that means is that groups like Families Over Billionaires, or previously a group called Unrig Our Economy, or Americans for Tax Fairness, or Rural Victory Fund, all of these groups on their face appear, grassroots and individual, and certainly they might have their own staff, but they are all one and the same, legally speaking, as the Arabella managed nonprofit groups. And so a few years ago, a group called Americans for Public Trust, which is part of the conservative Leonard Leo network, filed a complaint with the government demanding an investigation into their allegation that Arabella Advisors and its founder, former Clinton administration official Eric Kessler, that he was sort of unlawfully enriching himself via the management of those nonprofits and them taking large fees to manage all these other groups. And that's a similar allegation that's been lodged against the Leo network, which is sort of stationed and closely affiliated with a PR firm in Washington, D.C. called CRC Advisors, which conducts work and works on behalf of a network of nonprofit organizations that also sort of ties to Leonard Leo. So the political clash is it continues to go on and has been going on, but Arabella is actually much larger than that right-leaning network. The groups managed by Arabella Advisors last year doled out, it was something, I believe, it was $1.4 billion. And so that shows how much untraceable money goes out from these groups, and it goes to a number of causes: environmentalism, healthcare related initiatives, social justice initiatives. Name the issue on the left. They're certainly behind it and funding it.
Gabe Kaminsky, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
More Rising right after this.